the West being, the United Nations being a Western institution. It's also got to do with international agenda the United Nations takes care of. For example, the United Nations is for free trade. That means when you're rehabilitating agricultural areas, you always want to prioritize export crops that would be more beneficial towards what could be exported or free traded with other nations at a cost of what you might want to do with that land. There are agenda, Mr. Speaker, that are tailor-fit to international cooperation. But we think that these could come directly against what people might want or what people could be more benefited with. Like irrigation policies and irrigation infrastructure that are subsidized by the state, that drive prices of crops down in the long run. These things become less likely to come about when you have a body in charge that doesn't have the direct interests of people, but rather the interests of the world. Here we're going to make a concession. This might not be what's best for every nation in the world. But in terms of disaster areas, no matter how corrupt they are, these people rely on that nation for legitimacy and they wouldn't go against their best interests. It's a tough choice, but corruption will always be there. It's about what we do with what we can, and what we need to do now is oppose this motion.
We will now have the government witness.
Ladies and gentlemen, what side opposition has failed to realize is that we are talking about situations of relief, disaster relief, that involves reconstruction and efforts that we have repeatedly told you that even though the central government would want to do something, at the local level, nothing is going to get done. All your humanitarian efforts will be for naught. And we're going to address the simplistic case offered by the opposing opposition and tell you how people rioting and looting is quite different from the idea of political legitimacy. Okay, so first of all, on the idea of sovereignty and how the central government will react, and second of all, the impact on long-term development and reconstruction efforts. Now, firstly, OWO has been telling us that, okay, you don't want to piss off these governments because, you've branded them as corrupt. And apparently, the corruption index does not take into account how they react to disasters or how much they love their people. Now, first of all, if you are a corrupt country by a lot of indicators, and we see that you systematically deprive your people of benefits and welfare, then we do doubt how this actually stands. But we also point out this is in fact a matter of fiat, right? You can't really just say, okay, I'm pissed off, I'm not going to let you in, etc., etc. But second of all, opposing opposition came and told us, okay, you have to respect the mandate of the people, you have to have sovereignty. First of all, on the idea of sovereignty, now the UN office has a clear and defined mandate of relief and reconstruction, and we don't really see how this could be infringing, as, like I said, the central government has an interest in focusing on other efforts while making sure the humanitarian efforts are met, right? We don't see how there's necessarily a clash between that. But second of all, regarding how you should respect the mandate of these apparently magically elected people, which we're talking about highly corrupt countries in the first place. I don't see what kind of political mandate you're talking about. But even if we're talking about this, this assumption that Daryl has made throughout his entire speech is that local governments now are somehow accountable. We've already told you, we're talking about systemically corrupt countries where at local levels, even if the central government gives out a directive, just look at China. China centrally is against corruption. What happens at the local and municipal level is corruption at bound, right? That is what we're talking about. We are focusing on a local level. So, no thank you. So second of all, let's talk about the impact on the reconstruction efforts and other things such as safety and security, right? So OWO has been telling us, okay, we don't want to politicize the bureaucratic UN, it's going to cause delay, etc., etc. No, thank you. Now we've already told you how the UN, we're not talking about Security Council, we're not talking about General Assembly. These offices are hugely specialized, and they also have they are hugely resourced in these, they are specialized in these efforts, right? No, thank you. But second of all, we see that the UN is able to coordinate NGOs, to coordinate all international and local efforts at humanitarian assistance, right? Because they have the incentive to provide such humanitarian assistance because that is exactly their mandate. Let's look at the comparison, which is, governments who are, as I've said, corrupted, right? So why exactly, if I have this opportunity, chance to, thank you, to garner all the benefits I can from, siphoning away funds during, reconstruction efforts, why the hell would I be interested in, maintaining accountability and making sure that the NGOs are all well coordinated, right? We don't see this is actually possible. And then CO came out and told us, okay, no, we have this opportunistic crime, we have looting, and then the lack of stable law enforcement. Now, we have to point out that the flag, no, thank you, I have to finish this first. There is a difference between a perception of the rule of law versus the legitimacy of government. What they're trying to tell you is that, okay, if I loot, then I feel that I'm free. You need me to feel that if I loot, I will get shot. That's what he's been trying to tell you. And then we see this is different from legitimacy of government, which is whether or not the government is a functional government, whether or not the government is working in my best interest, etc., right? All of this kind of like riots or any kind of an instability that Daryl has been trying to portray is like for entirely different reasons as to your moral or value judgment on whether or not the local government, the local government or the municipality is acting in my best interest, right? And we see it is precisely this distinction which Jeff has brought you an extension. Yes.
If states with the best ability and closest ability to respond first to disasters have to make a political consideration of being associated with a state that is deemed corrupt by the international community, delaying response, who's going to be accountable and how are you going to be accountable for the lives lost?
Okay, so I'm not sure if you're talking about the government or the people's feelings, right? But if you're talking about the central government, I already told you how, in the interest of trying to at least look that they love their people, as you've been telling us, well, they do want the situation to be resolved as soon as possible. They need to focus their efforts beyond the immediate safety issues and rescue efforts, but also about long-term reconstruction. But we told you how. No, thank you. We told you in Jeff's speech how we have two issues we're dealing with. First is the idea of entrenched corruption, and second, how we want to drive political change. Right? So we've told you how there's essentially a reverse election process in place if you're looking at a corrupt situation. Right? Let's say a tendering process for reconstruction. You have two contractors, A takes bribes, B doesn't. What happens? A gets the contract in the end because whoever has enough money will be able to pull the strings. Right? We see that this causes an endemic and entrenched phenomenon of corruption, no thank you, whereby like in the long term, you start with these schools that have shoddy foundations and it goes on and on, right? So we see that we don't really see how all of this is addressed adequately under their model if you just say, okay, leave everything to them and they will somehow harass you. They seem to do a good job. We do not believe that's the case. Now this brings me to the second issue of how it drives political change. It's related in that it provides visual evidence and concrete results, right? Because if I am a parent, I don't want my kid to go to school in this shoddily constructed school that's like a shanty shack in Sichuan, right? So we see that people do have vested interests. They do feel that their interests are at stake. We want to drive organic development by having this kind of visceral comparison and difference. Right? We want to see, okay, look, under accountability and transparency, this is what happens. Under the local corrupted government, the school falls down, right? So this is what we are trying to talk about. Now, we tell you that local governments and locals are already being very oppressed under status quo in these endemically corrupted regimes, right? When we look at, again, we see how the central government's message may not necessarily translate into actual policy initiatives or even actual reconstructive efforts when you go down to the local level. And that's precisely the problem that they have failed to consider. We believe in reconstruction efforts in the long term, right? We don't it's not just about the immediate rescue effort, but about how you try to stem the idea of endemic and systemic corruption. And it's only with closing government's idea that it can truly be solved. And that's why we're preparing for it.
To win the semi-final, we'd like to invite the opposition.
Right, more than just the immediate effects of the policy, this debate gets to some very, very fundamental questions about what the UN is, how it ought to act, and what it ought to be in relation to nation states and how they govern their people. That's why I have two issues. The first will be about what the UN is, why sovereignty actually has a value, and why that was needlessly brushed aside by everyone on the government bench. Opening government barely even talked about it. The second thing I'm going to talk about will be what happens to people, society, and everything on two levels. First of all, in terms of immediate relief, on why they haven't shown any evidence that immediate relief has been insufficient. They've only shown conjectures, and I will show logic and analysis as to why we actually do get relief to people on the ground. Then I'll talk about reconstruction efforts and why they're not consultative, absolutely undemocratic, most likely going to get hijacked by international forces. Way of doing things is bad for many reasons. So let's go on to that first issue. What is the UN? Very, very clearly across all of history, that has had the UN in it, it is not a world government. It is not the world police, though it may try to be sometimes because of America. Theme for later on. It is not the world's nanny or what have you. It is it is in the UN's very charter not to impose on sovereign states that are not giving consent for any sort of UN action that they are not deciding to receive. Now, let's deal with this local government, national level government dichotomy that most of the government side has tried to hide behind, saying that their policy doesn't actually have to deal with sovereignty and therefore they don't have to argue about it or even think about it, right? What they're talking about is the status quo, and if you believe them, then they're actually proposing nothing. Why is that? Because the states as they exist today will always already mandate that their local governments cooperate with international organizations in this extent, or give authority to the extent that it wants to give authority to international organizations anyway. What is at stake, Mr. Speaker, is their right to say no, or to say this only goes this far because we want to be in charge of these particular things, and we're going to keep our people in charge of these particular things, and we are going to be in charge of the direction and the implementation that it is going to take. What?
So a democratic mandate that functions perfectly would make corruption a paradox. The fact of the matter is you can hide corruption in terms of both giving and contracting, and that's where the UN can take charge and ensure that it doesn't happen.
Yes, and it is the UN solely determining where it will take charge and where these people still have their sovereignty. That is exactly what I am saying is still wrong. But what is what hasn't been explicitly stood behind until that POI, what has been implied throughout everyone on the government side is this, that corruption is sufficient reason to nullify sovereignty. We don't think they've even been consistent in making that claim, because why do we even still recognize them as a state at all? Sovereignty literally is one of the things that is necessary for a state to be defined as a state. Why do we still give them any forms of aid if we can't trust them to not just corrupt it away? Why do we still let them be in charge of health services in that country, of social services in that country, of emergency services or utilities? They're pretty much even just setting laws in those countries. We recognize that those states may not be perfect, and every state in the world has a non-zero corruption index, that it is in the interests of these states to protect themselves and to perpetuate in a way that they are standing on their own two feet and continually developing, making it so that they themselves get better and international organizations that work through states also continuously improve. If we go with their logic, then we're going to stagnate at exactly where we are, because those states aren't even going to be improving anymore, because they're just going to become dependent. But what is the important thing principally, what is the important practical effect of this principle being left behind as blatantly as it was sit down? What is legitimacy's brushed aside value? What they are going to do is they're going to perpetuate the weak state. My partner made this very clear. When you're actively and this clearly undermining the legitimacy as an international body with a lot of respect of the state that many of these people will live in, not only are they more susceptible to committing crimes, Mr. Speaker, generally a weakness of your faith in your state makes it so that you're less willing to participate in state efforts that will legitimately help people. The culture in the Philippines right now, in relation to the the Philippine government is that if you have a smart child, you will tell that child to go into business. If you have a smart child that wants to help out the world, you will not tell that child to go into government. You will tell them to set up some kind of social entrepreneurship or something like that. Because you have so strongly taught them to lose faith in the government that no one would consider becoming a judge anymore. People who wanted to help other people out through the legal system would no longer consider becoming a lawyer. People who would want to do any kind of difference at the state level, which has the mandate of the people, will not decide to do that. And the most talented people in your country will be going away from the avenues where they can most effectively help sit down. Last issue, what happens to people, society, and everything? First of all, at the level of immediate relief, they have shown absolutely no evidence at all. It is past 6 of people of aid in terms of immediate relief being at a shortage in any country that has been disaster struck, because the international response is so strong that even when significant percentages of the aid that comes down is corrupted away, that they get to make the most use of it anyway, and anyone that may have been saved will be saved. It does reach people, and we think this happens because even corrupt governments will put facilities in place, even just tokenistically, that will work to some extent, and they're still voted in. So if they do a blatantly bad job, probably they're not going to be in office the next term, and they realize that they have to help people to some extent. But in terms of reconstruction efforts, this is the least democratic way of going about that. What is most likely going to happen, Mr. Speaker, since they're going to control the direction of the urban planning and the direction of the economic zoning and all of these things, is that it's going to be oriented towards free market neoliberal capitalism, which is not going to be aligned with what a lot of people might want in terms of social empowerment and in terms of social services, which might be stronger at the cost of the free market. This has been the problem with the IMF. This has been the problem with the World Bank. They're ideologically opposed to what a lot of more poor people in the world want, because they are opposed to more socialist, leftist issues that would actually benefit a lot of people. We are very glad to oppose.
Please rise, shake hand, and leave the room. And could everybody please go back to the main